You think you know George Washington. The cherry tree, the wooden teeth, the stoic father of our nation who couldn't tell a lie. But what if I told you almost everything you think you know is wrong? George Washington did not have wooden teeth. He never chopped down a cherry tree, and he was far from the marble statue we've turned him into. The real Washington was infinitely more interesting than the legend. He was a man who survived smallpox and multiple battles where bullets literally tore through his clothing. A land speculator who became one of the wealthiest men in America. A slave owner who eventually freed his slaves in his will, making him the only founding father to do so. A general who lost more battles than he won, yet still won the war. And perhaps most surprisingly, he became America's largest whiskey producer. Today, we're going to explore the real George Washington, the unusual facts, the contradictions, the failures, and the triumphs that made him one of history's most remarkable figures. This is the story they don't tell you in school. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Though, if you're being technical, under the old Julian calendar, it was actually February 11th. His family was wealthy, but not elite, which shaped much of his early ambition. Here's something unusual. Washington had almost no formal education. While other founding fathers like Jefferson and Adams went to college, Washington's schooling ended around age 15. His father died when he was 11, and the family couldn't afford to send him to England for education like his older half-brothers. This left Washington deeply insecure about his lack of formal learning for his entire life. He obsessively copied out rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation as a teenager. All 110 rules, trying to teach himself how to be a gentleman. At age 17, Washington became a land surveyor. This wasn't just any job. In colonial Virginia, knowing the land meant knowing where wealth was. Washington was literally mapping out the future of America's expansion, and he was making mental notes about which land to buy for himself. By age 20, Washington had purchased his first tract of land in the Shenandoah Valley. He would spend his entire life accumulating land, eventually owning more than 50,000 acres across Virginia and what would become West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, Kentucky, and Ohio. Then came 1751, and one of the most consequential trips in American history. Washington traveled to Barbados with his half-brother Lawrence, who had tuberculosis. This was the only time Washington ever left what would become the United States. While there, he contracted smallpox. The disease nearly killed him and left his face permanently scarred with pockmarks. But here's the unusual part. This terrible illness may have saved his life and changed history. Having survived smallpox, Washington was now immune. During the Revolutionary War, smallpox would kill more soldiers than combat. Washington's immunity meant he could command armies through smallpox epidemics without fear. Some historians argue that without this childhood disease, Washington might not have survived the Revolution. In 1753, at just 21 years old, Washington got his first military assignment. The Virginia governor sent him into the wilderness to tell French forces to leave the Ohio Valley. This mission made Washington famous, but not for the reasons you might think. Washington's journal from this expedition became a published sensation, but it also revealed his inexperience. He got lost multiple times, nearly drowned crossing a freezing river, and was almost killed by a Native American guide. The next year, 1754, is where Washington's story takes a dark turn that almost no one talks about. Now a lieutenant colonel, Washington was ordered back to the Ohio Valley with troops. And here, he made a catastrophic mistake. Washington's forces ambushed a French diplomatic party, killing the commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The French insisted this was a diplomatic mission protected by international law. Washington claimed they were spies. The truth remains debated, but many historians believe this action by young George Washington literally started the French and Indian War, which then escalated into the 7 Years' War, the first true World War. As French forces retaliated, Washington hastily built Fort Necessity. The fort was positioned in a meadow, surrounded by hills, in what any experienced military officer would recognize as an indefensible position. The French easily surrounded it, and Washington was forced to surrender. He signed a document in French that he couldn't read, which included an admission that he had assassinated Jumonville. This was Washington's first command, and it was a complete disaster. He had potentially started a global war and been forced to surrender. Yet somehow, Washington spun this into a learning experience that would shape his later military genius. Washington learned something crucial from this failure. He learned that survival sometimes matters more than glory, that defensive positions matter more than aggressive charges, and that a fighting retreat can be more valuable than a foolish stand. These lessons would define his Revolutionary War strategy. Fast forward to 1775. The colonies are on the brink of revolution, and the Continental Congress needs a general. They chose Washington for surprising reasons. He looked the part at 6'2", and showed up to Congress in his military uniform. And crucially, he was from Virginia. The revolution started in Massachusetts, and they needed Southern support. Washington accepted command, but did something unusual. He refused a salary. He only asked that Congress pay his expenses. This seems noble until you see the expense reports he submitted. Washington claimed expenses of more than $449,000 in today's dollars for items including alcohol, horses, and even the cost of his headquarters. He probably would have made more money taking the salary. As a military commander, Washington's record was mixed. He lost more battles than he won. The British captured New York, Philadelphia, and nearly captured him multiple times. So how did he win the war? Washington understood something his British counterparts didn't. He didn't have to win battles. He just had to not lose the war. As long as his army existed, the revolution continued. He famously said, "We should, on all occasions, avoid a general action, or put anything to the risk, unless compelled by a necessity into which we ought never to be drawn." This Fabian strategy of avoiding direct confrontation while harassing British forces eventually worked. The British couldn't occupy the entire continent, couldn't sustain their supply lines, and couldn't break the American will to resist. Washington's finest moment came at Trenton in December 1776. After a series of devastating defeats, morale was collapsing and enlistments were expiring. On Christmas night, Washington led his troops across the ice-choked Delaware River in a snowstorm and launched a surprise attack on Hessian forces. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological turning point. But here's an unusual fact about that famous crossing. The iconic painting by Emanuel Leutze shows Washington standing heroically in the boat. In reality, Washington almost certainly would have been sitting down. Standing in a boat crossing an ice-filled river in a storm would have been suicidal. But the myth is more powerful than the reality. Let's talk about the real George Washington, because he was far more complex and interesting than the icon we've created. First, his appearance. Washington was tall, athletic, and imposing. But by his 50s, he was also in constant pain. His teeth began failing him in his 20s, and by the time he became president, he had only one natural tooth left. His dentures were not wooden. That's a complete myth. They were made from hippopotamus ivory, human teeth, animal teeth, and metal springs. They were painful, didn't fit well, and gave him a distorted facial expression. This is why he rarely smiled and looked so stern in portraits. The dentures also affected his speech, giving him a slight lisp. Combined with his Virginian accent, foreign visitors sometimes had trouble understanding him. Washington had a legendary temper. He swore like a soldier, which he was. During the Battle of Monmouth, Washington reportedly unleashed such a torrent of profanity at General Charles Lee that witnesses were shocked. As one officer put it, Washington's swearing lasted till the leaves shook on the trees. He later quoted, "Discipline is the soul of an army." Washington loved dogs and is considered one of the founding fathers of the American foxhound breed. He gave his dogs unusual names like Sweet Lips, Tipsy, Drunkard, and Madame Moose. He was also passionate about breeding mules and received a prize donkey from the King of Spain as a gift. Here's something truly unusual. Washington was a meticulous record keeper, and his diaries reveal some mundane obsessions. He recorded the weather nearly every day. He noted when his slaves had children. He tracked his whiskey production down to the gallon. But he rarely wrote about his feelings or emotions. Even the death of his stepson Patsy Custis gets only a brief mention. Speaking of whiskey, Mount Vernon operated one of the largest distilleries in America by 1799, producing nearly 11,000 gallons per year. Washington knew there was money in spirits, and he was right. The distillery was highly profitable. In 1789, Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. He's still the only president to receive 100% of the electoral votes, and he did it twice. Washington didn't want the job. He was 57, tired, and wanted to retire to Mount Vernon. But he understood that the new nation needed him. He wrote to his friend Henry Knox, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." As president, Washington set precedents that still shape the office today. He insisted on being called Mr. President, rather than Your Excellency or Your Highness. He established the cabinet system. He limited himself to 2 terms, creating a tradition that lasted until FDR. Washington was so conscious of setting precedents that he consulted advisors on everything from how he should dress to whether he should accept dinner invitations. He understood that everything he did would become a template for future presidents. One unusual fact, Washington's second inauguration speech is the shortest in history, at just 135 words. He clearly wanted to keep it brief. Washington's presidency was marked by fierce debates between Hamilton and Jefferson over the direction of the country. Washington tried to stay above these disputes, but generally sided more with Hamilton's vision of a strong federal government. After 2 terms, Washington voluntarily gave up power and went home. King George III, when told that Washington planned to resign and return to his farm, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." This peaceful transfer of power was almost unprecedented in history and established democracy in America. Washington retired to Mount Vernon, where he finally got to focus on farming and his whiskey distillery. But his retirement was short. In December 1799, Washington spent hours riding around his estate in freezing rain and snow. He developed a throat infection, likely epiglottitis. His doctors used the medical practices of the time, which meant bleeding him repeatedly. They drained about 40% of his blood over a few hours. Washington knew he was dying. His last words were, "'Tis well." He died on December 14th, 1799, at age 67. The treatments almost certainly killed him faster than the illness would have. Here's something unusual. When Washington died, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered 10 days of mourning in France. The British Royal Navy lowered its flags to half-mast. His death was mourned around the world. His former enemy recognized his greatness. So what do we know about George Washington? He was a man of contradictions, a passionate advocate of liberty who owned slaves, a man who craved military glory, but whose greatest strength was knowing when not to fight. Someone with little formal education who became one of history's most effective leaders. A person who desperately wanted to retire, but kept answering his country's call. Let me leave you with some of his most famous and revealing quotes. "It is better to offer no excuse than a bad one." This spoke to his character and his belief in personal responsibility. "Discipline is the soul of an army. It makes small numbers formidable, procures success to the weak, and esteem to all." This was the lesson he learned from his early failures. "Guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism." Washington warned against those who would use nationalism for their own ends. "Observe good faith and justice toward all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all." This was part of his farewell address, warning against foreign entanglements. And perhaps most famously, the very atmosphere of firearms anywhere and everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that's good. Though modern, this reflects debates he witnessed about militias and armed citizens. But my favorite Washington quote is this: "I hope I shall possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man." The real George Washington was not the flawless marble statue we've created. He was a man who made mistakes, lost battles, owned slaves, had a temper, and cared deeply about his reputation. But he was also a man who learned from failure, who voluntarily gave up power, who evolved in his thinking, and who understood that character and precedent matter more than glory. He wasn't perfect, but his imperfect humanity, his growth, and his ultimate choices made him the right man for the moment when America needed him most. And that's far more inspiring than any myth. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real George Washington, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let me know in the comments what surprised you most about Washington's real story. And what great American should we cover next?